One of my favorite arrangements of Lift Every Voice and Sing, arranged by Roland M. Carter. And one of my favorite presentations of that arrangement, the Oakwood Aeolians. Bravo. And thank you so much. We do not own the rights to that music, of course, but we are proud and privileged to play it today as we celebrate, nationally at least, the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the drum major for justice. And it wouldn't be love in the Love and Stuff community if we didn't take a few moments to celebrate and herald this great drum major for justice who accomplished so much in his lifetime and is still accomplishing more thereafter. And hopefully you and I have aligned our thoughts and thinking and action with the dream to help to make the dream come alive and to help the dream to flourish. So whether you're watching us this evening here on Facebook, on the Love and Stuff community page or the Marcus R. Holmes page, on Twitch TV, on YouTube events, on LinkedIn Live, or on Twitter. I hope that you will drop in the comments, and I hope that you will click share and tag 5 of your closest connections, subscribers, or friends, 5 of the more popular ones to join in tonight's celebration as we do some excerpts from the dream. We'll be sharing more reading content than video content because we don't own the rights to all of that content. But I wanted to share the sources with you. We're going to be sharing from A Call to Conscience, the landmark speeches of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is available. The version of the dream speech that we want to share from is when it was first presented here in Detroit, Michigan, back in 1963. Also, from his great work, Where Do We Go From Here? We want to share some excerpts from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s great work. We'll also be sharing Little Fires Everywhere, Pandemic, Protest, Politics and Power, co-authored by Dr. Valencia Etner, who is a member of our Love and Stuff community, and Dr. Van Carl Williams. Want to share a bit from that, and of course a bit from Barack Obama, The Audacity of Hope, from his epilogue. And so we will be sharing quite a number of pieces throughout this short time together, and I hope that you will be with us instead of maybe some of the video content to which we do not own the rights. But I am sure that everybody has heard of the Drum Major of Justice, but it bears to say Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday was yesterday, January 15th, was born in 1929, died in April 4th, 1968, and he is considered one of history's greatest speakers, orators, and social activists. His leadership in peaceful protest helped end segregation as we knew it during the American Civil Rights Movement. Interesting to some, and many may already know this, when he was born, his parents, Michael and Alberta, gave him a different name from the one we know today. They called him Michael. But Michael Sr. later changed his name and his son's name to Martin Luther after the famous religious leader. The middle-class family was very religious. Both Martin's father and grandfather were pastors in Atlanta, Georgia, and they grew up in a loving home but experienced racism from an early age. King attended public schools in Georgia, and as you may know, he skipped 9th and 11th grades and graduated from high school at the age of 15. And it was around that time that he joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, a civil rights organization that his father led the Atlanta chapter at that time. He graduated from Morehouse College in 1948. He went on to study religion at Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. In 1951, he graduated with honors and was class valedictorian. Soon after, he enrolled in a PhD program at Boston University in Massachusetts. He met music student there, Coretta Scott, and they married and later had 2 sons and daughters. Of course, you're going to hear throughout many of the great things about him, but I wanted to bear repeating those things because on this holiday that we celebrate, his birthday, one of the most single formidable figures in our American history and worth celebrating and repeating. And so I definitely want to share with you from all right, someone on thank you so much for joining us. From the Call to Conscience, which is a work that cites many of his landmark speeches, I wanted to read from that an excerpt of this from the first, really, I Have a Dream speech. And the foreword to this address at the Freedom Rally, which happened on June 23rd, 1963, here in Detroit at Cobo Hall. Aretha, the Queen of Soul, and Irma Franklin write a little bit about their experience of meeting him. And I just want to share a bit of their excerpt and then a bit from the dream excerpt of that first rendering of the dream. They write, the Detroit March was set for June 23rd, culminating in a rally at the downtown Cobo Hall. The march was a huge success, and the crowd was so enthusiastic that at one point, Dr. King, my father, she refers to Dr. C.L. Franklin, Ben McFaul, Walter Reuther, and Mayor Kavanaugh were literally swept off their feet as they linked arms at the front of the march when the crowd, swelling to over 150,000 people, surged forward. Dr. King called it the largest and greatest demonstration for freedom ever held in the United States. And so I wanted to just give you that picture and imagery if you haven't seen those pictures or heard of that speech that maybe wasn't as famous at the time as the March on Washington speech that happened later. But that speech first happened at Cobo Hall. And can you imagine them locked arms and the crowd pushing forward and almost raising them, or as Aretha says, literally raising them off their feet? And so I wanted you to have that imagery as I read from a part of the original Dream speech. And I may remove my glasses at points that I can see. So he writes from his speech, he says, as I move toward my conclusion, you're asking, I'm sure, what can we do here in Detroit to help in the struggle in the South? Well, there are several things that you can do. One of them you've already done, and I hope you will do it in even greater dimensions before leaving this meeting. Now, the second thing that you can do to help us down in Alabama and Mississippi and all over the South is to work with determination to get rid of any segregation and discrimination in Detroit. Realizing that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And we've got to come to see that the problem of racial injustice is a national problem. No community in this country can boast of clean hands in the area of brotherhood. Now, in the North, it's different in that it doesn't have the legal sanction that it has had in the South. But it has its subtle and hidden forms, and it exists in three areas: in the area of employment discrimination, in the area of housing discrimination, and in the area of de facto segregation in the public schools. And we must come to see that the de facto segregation in the North is just as injurious of the actual segregation in the South. And so if you want to help us in Alabama and Mississippi and over the South, do all that you can to get rid of the problem there. And then we also need your support in order to get the civil rights bill that the president is offering passed. And that's a reality. Let us not fool ourselves. I'm going down a little farther, and thank you those of you that are joining: Marion Richardson, Timothy Dennis, Jan Holmes Boyd. Please click share. And I do not want to give you the impression that it's going to be easy, he writes, or he speaks. There can be no great social gain without individual pain. And before the victory for brotherhood is won, some more will have to be scoured up a little bit. Before the victory is won, some more will be thrown into jail. Before the victory is won, some, like Medgar Evers, may have to face physical death. But if physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children and their white brothers from an eternal psychological death, then nothing can be more redemptive. Before the victory is won, some will be misunderstood and called bad names, but we must go on with a determination and with a faith that this problem can be solved. And so I go back to the South not in despair. I go back to the South not with a feeling that we are caught in a dark dungeon that will never lead to a way out. I go back believing that the new day is coming. And so this afternoon, I have a dream, he said. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day, right down in Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to live together as brothers. I pause at that point in the speech because I wonder what he would say today, knowing that the first African-American senator in Georgia, Dr. Raphael Warnock, is working hand in hand with others across the chasm of race and ethnicity, even though Georgia has very demarcated racial lines. But some of that dream has come true, right? Back to the speech. I have a dream this afternoon. He said that one day, little white children and little Negro children will be able to join hands as brothers and sisters. I have a dream this afternoon that one day men will no longer burn down houses and the church of God simply because people want to be free. I have a dream this afternoon that there will be a day that we will no longer face the atrocities that Emmett Till had to face or Medgar Evers had to face, but that all men can live with dignity. And I pause again because we're thinking of all of the names, and you can drop them in the comments of Philando Castile and Sandra Bland and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and many others who have faced atrocities because of the lack of being able to live with dignity. So we still have work to do there, right? I have a dream this afternoon, I continue from the speech, that my four little children will not come up in the same young days that I came up within, but that they will be judged on the basis of the content of their character and not the color of their skin. I pause again because there are corporations and organizations all around who are utilizing the excuse of recessive patterns to say that they will abandon their diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging initiatives. And shame on them. Those initiatives are so needed today as much as they were needed during the time of the speech of dreaming, so that children who are in the educational pipeline will be given the skills that really are needed in employment. And the skills will be equal level of playing. So whether we have children in the school system, it is incumbent upon all of us to ensure that our educational systems have equity and are arming our children with the skills that will give them the jobs of the future without the color of their skin, without regard to it, right? I have a dream this afternoon, the speech continues, that one day right here in Detroit, he said, Negroes will be able to buy a house or rent a house anywhere that their money will carry them, and that they will be able to get a job. All of these parts of his dream. Yes, I have a dream this afternoon that one day in this land, the words of Amos the prophet will become real, and justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I have a dream this evening that one day we will recognize the words of Jefferson that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I have a dream this afternoon, he goes on. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. I have a dream this afternoon that the brotherhood of man will become a reality in this day. And with this hope, he said, I will go out and carve a tunnel of hope through the mountain of despair. With this faith, I will go out with you and transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. With this faith, we will be able to achieve this new day when all of God's children, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing with the Negroes in the spiritual of old. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty. We are free at last. And again, this is an excerpt of his speech delivered in Detroit, Michigan, June 23rd, 1963, at the Freedom Rally at Coble Hall. It is an excerpt of the book, A Call to Consciousness. And I hope that if you haven't purchased it, you would. It chronicles a number of his landmark speeches. Good evening, those that are joining him, Hassan and others. A Call to Consciousness. These are the landmark speeches of Dr. King. When we come back after a short break, I want to talk a little bit from one of his last works. Where do we go from here? Some of the excerpts there. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. You've heard him lay out in that speech the first time that he did the I Have a Dream speech, or the first version, if you will, things that he dreamt about. And I'm wondering, do you see any of those things coming to reality? And how can you and I bring those things to pass? I'm Marcus Holmes. This is the Love and Stuff community across all platforms, celebrating the great drum major for justice, Dr. Martin Luther King. Maybe today was a day of reflection or a day of service. Here is a brief talk on the ML King as a day of service. I hope it resonates with you, and we'll be right back.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s message can be heard everywhere.
His words changed the nation.
And though you might not know where the words came from,
you can feel the truth behind them.
We're now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We're confronted with the fierce urgency of now.
The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. called us all to service.
Opportunities to serve those in need are all around you.
And every time you volunteer to read to a child, serve a hearty meal, or clean up a park in your comunidad, his message becomes a reality.
This January is your chance to let MLK's word inspire you to action.
You can volunteer for a better tomorrow on MLK Day at AmeriCorps.gov/MLK Day.
Always an opportunity to make it a day of service. We are celebrating and lauding, heralding the great drum major for justice, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday was yesterday, and today we celebrate it as a national holiday. Maybe a part of your celebration was a breakfast or lunch or a walk or a march, and maybe a part of your celebration was acts of service and reflecting. And I wanted to share from the Love and Stuff community all of that as we come to the close of the day, and share with you from the last written book by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the segment, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? In 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. isolated himself from the demands of the civil rights movement, rented a house in Jamaica with no telephone, and labored over his final manuscript. In this prophetic work, he lays out his thoughts, plans, and dreams for America's future, including the need for better jobs, higher wages, decent housing, and quality education. With a universal message, of hope that continues to resonate, he demanded an end to global suffering, asserting that humankind, for the first time, had the resources and technology to eradicate poverty. And so I want to read a number of the excerpts out of this masterpiece, and it is indeed prophetic, as you will know, of the great work in life and witness of Dr. King. I read from chapter 1, Where Are We? And this was back, of course, in 1967. So it goes back, and there's some stark contrast about the progress and the stagnation. On August 6, 1965, the president's room of the Capitol could scarcely hold the multitude of white and Negro leaders crowding it. President Lyndon Johnson's high spirits were marked as he circulated among the many guests whom he had invited to witness an event he confidently felt to be historic: the signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The legislation was designed to put the ballot effectively into Negro hands in the South after a century of denial by terror and evasion. The bill laid out on the polished mahogany desk was born in violence in Selma, Alabama, where a stubborn sheriff handling Negroes in the Southern tradition had stumbled against the future. During a nonviolent demonstration for voting rights, the sheriff had directed his men in tear gassing and beating the marchers to the ground. The nation had seen and heard and exploded in indignation. In protest, Negroes and whites marched 50 miles through Alabama and arrived at the state capital of Montgomery in a demonstration 50,000 strong. President Johnson, describing Selma as a modern Concord, addressed a joint session of Congress before a television audience of millions. He pledged that, quote, "we shall overcome," unquote, and declared that the national government must by law ensure that every Negro has full rights as a citizen. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the result. In signing the measure, the president announced that, quote, "Today is a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield. Today, we strike away the last major shackle of fierce and ancient bonds," unquote. 1 year later, King writes, some of the people who had been brutalized in Selma and who were present at the Capitol ceremonies were leading marches in the suburbs of Chicago amid a rain of rocks and bottles, among burning automobiles, to the thunder of jeering thousands, many of them waving Nazi flags. A year later, some of the Negro leaders who had been present in Selma and at the Capitol ceremonies no longer held office in their organizations. They had been discarded to symbolize a radical change of tactics. A year later, the white backlash had become an emotional electoral issue in California, Maryland, and elsewhere. In several southern states, men long regarded as political clowns had become governors or only narrowly missing election. The magic achieved with a witch's brew of bigotry, prejudice, half-truths, and whole lies. So a stark contrast of what we had hoped to accomplish shortly, and then here is part of that contrast. Dr. King says a decade ago, not a single Negro entered the legislative chambers of the South except as a porter or chauffeur. Today, he writes during that time, 11 Negroes are member of the Georgia House. And as I said at the outset, I think he would be uber proud to know that Dr. Raphael Warnock, the first African-American senator from Georgia, is there today. 10 years ago, he writes in 67, Negroes seemed almost invisible to the larger society, and the facts of their harsh lives were unknown to the majority of the nation. Today, civil rights is a dominating issue in every state, crowding the pages of the press and the daily conversation of white Americans. In this decade of change, the Negro stood up and confronted his oppressor. He faced the bullies and the guns, the dogs and the tear gas. He put himself squarely before the vicious mobs and moved with strength and dignity toward them and decisively defeated them. For more than a century of slavery and another century of segregation, Negroes did not find mass unity, nor could they mount mass actions. The American brand of servitude tore them apart and held them in paralyzed solitude. But in the last decade, Negroes united and marched. And out of the new unity and action, vast monuments of dignity were shaped, courage was forged, and hope took concrete form. For hundreds of years, Negroes have fought to stay alive by developing an endurance to hardship and heartbreak. In this decade, the Negro stepped into a new role. He no longer would endure, he would resist and win. He still had the age-old capacity to live in hunger and want, but now he banished these as his lifelong companions. He could tolerate humiliation and scorn, but now he armed himself with dignity and resistance, and his adversaries tasted the gall of defeat. For the first time in his history, the Negro did not have to use subterfuge as a defense or solicit pity. His endurance was not employed for compromise with evil, but to supply the strength to crush it. He came out of his struggle, integrated only slightly in the external society, but powerfully integrated within. This was the victory that had to precede all other gains. He made his government write new laws to alter some of the cruelest injustices that affected him. He made an indifferent and unconcerned nation rise from lethargy and recognize his oppression and struggle with a newly aroused conscience. He gained manhood in the nation that had always called him boy. These were the values he won that enlivened hope, even while sluggish progress made no substantial changes in the quality or quantity of his daily bread. The great deal the Negro has won in spiritual undergirding and the great deal he has not won in material progression indicates the strengths and weaknesses in the life of the Negro in 1967. They also reveal that no matter how many obstacles persist, the Negro's forward march can no longer be stopped. And I wanted to share that excerpt. I think it is so important. Like I said, this prophetic work talked about the contrast and the gains, the material and the spiritual gains of what was integrated within and what was not yet integrated with the external society. I'm going to the section on Black Power, but I must share with you, to give some context to it, a little bit about James Meredith, whom you may have already heard of. But on June 5th, 1966, equipped with only a helmet and a walking stick, James Meredith began a 220-mile march against fear from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi. Mr. Meredith was an activist who had enrolled as the first African American or Negro in Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, 4 years earlier. And he organized this one-man march to encourage African Americans in Mississippi to register to vote and to challenge the culture of fear perpetrated by white supremacists in the state. Mr. Meredith crossed the Mississippi border on the morning of June 6, 1966, accompanied by a handful of friends and supporters. State police and federal FBI agents monitored the march while reporters and photographers trailed behind. A few miles south of Hernando, Mississippi, Aubrey Norvell, a white salesman, ambushed James Meredith from the woods and shot him in the neck, head, and back. Before he started shooting, Mr. Norvell warned bystanders to disperse, and he twice shouted James Meredith's names from the woods, but law enforcement did nothing to protect James Meredith. He survived his injuries, but was unable to immediately continue the march. Enraged by this attack, civil rights leaders organized to continue the march to Jackson in Mr. Meredith's place. And on June 26, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Stokely Carmichael, and Floyd McKissick were among the thousands of marchers who completed the trip after weathering harassment and physical abuse from angry mobs and law enforcement alike. Mr. Meredith rejoined that march shortly before it reached Jackson and led a rally at the state capitol. And in November 1966, Aubrey Norvell pleaded guilty to assault and battery and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. So the second section takes up as this group of civil rights leaders have left Mr. Meredith, checking on him, ensuring that things were okay, and started to go to other cities and started to go through other cities as a part of this march. As the days progressed, Dr. King writes, debates and discussions continued, but they were usually pushed back to the background by the onrush of enthusiasm engendered by the large crowds that turned out to greet us in every town. We have been marching for about 10 days when we passed through Grenada on the way to Greenwood. Stokely did not conceal his growing eagerness to reach Greenwood. This was SNCC territory, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee territory, in the sense that the organization had worked courageously there during that turbulent summer of 1964. As we approached the city, large crowds of old friends and new turned out to welcome us. At a huge mass meeting that night, which was held in the city park, Stokely mounted the platform, and after arousing the audience with a powerful attack on Mississippi justice, he proclaimed, "What we need is Black power." Willie Ricks, the fiery orator of SNCC, leaped to the platform and shouted, "What do you want?" The crowd roared, "Black power." Again and again, Ricks cried, "What do you want?" And the response, Black Power, grew louder and louder until it reached fever pitch. So Greenwood turned out to be the arena for the birth of the Black Power slogan in the civil rights movement. The phrase had been long before used by Richard Wright and others, but never until that night had it been used as a slogan in the civil rights movement. For people who had been crushed so long by white power and who had been taught that Black was degrading, it had ready appeal. Immediately, however, I had reservations about its use, writes Dr. King. I had the deep feeling that it was an unfortunate choice of words for a slogan. Moreover, I saw it bringing about division within the ranks of the marchers. For a day or two, there was fierce competition between those who were wedded to the Black Power slogan and those wedded to freedom now. Speakers on each side sought desperately to get the crowds to chant their slogan the loudest. Sensing this widening split in our ranks, I asked Stokely and Floyd to join me in a frank discussion of the problem. We met the next morning, along with members each of our own staffs, in a small Catholic parish house in Yazoo City. For 5 long hours, I pleaded with the group to abandon the Black Power slogan. It was my contention that a leader had to be concerned about the problem of semantics. Each word, I said, has a denotative meaning, its explicit and recognized sense, and a connotative meaning, its suggestive sense. While the concept of legitimate Black power might be denotatively sound, the slogan Black Power carried the wrong connotations. I mentioned the implications of violence that the press had already attached to the phrase, and I went on to say that some of the rash statements on the part of a few marchers only reinforced this impression. Stokely replied by saying that the question of violence versus nonviolence was irrelevant. The real question was the need for Black people to consolidate their political and economic resources to achieve power. Power, he said, is the only thing respected in this world, and we must get it at any cost, unquote. Then he looked me squarely in the eyes and said, Martin, you know as well as I do that practically every other ethnic group in America has done just this. The Jews, the Irish, the Italians did it. Why can't we? This is just the point, I answered. No one has ever heard the Jews publicly chant a slogan of Jewish power, but they have power. Through group unity, determination, and creative endeavor, they have gained it. The same thing is true of the Irish and Italians. Neither group has used a slogan of Irish or Italian power, but they have worked hard to achieve it. This is exactly what we must do. We must use every constructive means to amass economic and political power. This is the kind of legitimate power we need. We must work to build racial pride and refute the notion that Black is evil and ugly. But this must come through a program, not merely through a slogan. I wanted to share that part of the Black Power story because maybe it's not as familiar to people. And as we see new movements come, the important things that I think we glean from this is that we do have to unite. We do have to come together, pool our resources of economic and personal power so that we can attain and amass the kind of legitimate power that we need. Economic power, political power. To gain the unity of these powers are critical. And in order to do that, we must build racial pride and refute every notion that Black is anything other than beautiful. Black is not ugly. It is not evil. It is beautiful. And until we instill that racial pride in every institution and build those things that we have in common, we will continue to struggle with slogans versus programs and initiatives that will work to bring us legitimate power. Thank you, Dr. King, for that. I am going to share a few more excerpts before we go, but just before we do that, I want to make sure that you click share and tag someone in this celebration. as we take excerpts of the dream and some of the excerpts of Dr. King's last written work. We want to share that with you, and we want to share this beautiful song with you as you're clicking share. It is a celebration fit for our King, the drum major of justice.
Keep your hand on that plow. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Noah, Noah, let me come in. Doors are fastened and the windows bent. Keep your hand on that plow and hold on. Hold on.
Noah said you done lost your track. Can't plow straight and keep looking back. Keep your hand on that plow and hold on. Hold on. That plow and never tire. Every time goes higher and higher and higher. Keep your hand on that plow. Hold on. Hold on. You got to hold. Keep your hand on that plow and hold on.
Hold on. Hold on. Keep your hand on that plow. God shall know the rainbow sign won't be water but fire next time. Keep your head on that plow and hold on.
Get to heaven, I'll tell you how. Keep your hand on the gospel plow. Keep your hand on that plow and hold on.
Through every trial, hold on. He is Jehovah Jireh. Hold on. God will take care of you. Hold on. He's gonna see you through. You just keep holding on. Hold on. Keep your hand on that plow. Hold on.
Masterfully and beautifully arranged by Carolyn Tribune Brewer. Thank you, Carolyn. I love that arrangement. Hold on, hold on. Thank you so much. Likes and loves across all platforms for the great work of an awesomely gifted and talented young woman, Carolyn Tribune Brewer. And we thank her for that wonderful rendition. I am going to another section in Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community of Dr. Martin Luther King, The Dilemma of Negro Americans. And I want to share some excerpts of that. And we have just 2 more excerpts, I think, before our epilogue excerpts from our other books. So thank you for your patience. And I hope that this is material that you will go back and review and for your own personal critical thinking about what we can do to further advance the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King. He writes, "The dilemma of white America is the source and cause of the dilemma of Negro America. Just as the ambivalence of white America grows out of their oppressor state, or status rather, the predicament of Negro Americans grows out of their oppressed status. It is impossible for white Americans to grasp the depths and dimension of the Negro's dilemma without understanding what it means to be a Negro in America. Of course, it is not easy to perform this act of empathy. Putting oneself in another's place is always fraught with difficulties. Over and over again, it is said in the Black ghettos of America that no white person can ever understand what it means to be a Negro. There is good reason for this assumption, for there is very little in the life and experience of white America that can compare to the curse the society has put on color. And yet, if the present chasm of hostility, fear, and distrust is to be bridged, the white man must begin to walk in the pathways of his Black brothers and must feel some of the pain and hurt that throbs within without any let up in their daily lives. The central quality in the Negro's life is pain. Pain so old and so deep that it shows up in almost every moment of his existence. It emerges in the cheerlessness of his sorrow songs, in the melancholy of his blues, and in the pathos of his sermons. The Negro, while laughing, sheds invisible tears that no hand can wipe away. In a highly competitive world, the Negro knows that a cloud of persistent denial stands between him and the sun, between him and life and power, between him and whatever he needs. In the words of a noble Black bard of yesteryear, Paul Laurence Dunbar says, "A crust of bread and a corner to sleep in, a minute to smile and an hour to weep in, a pint of joy to a peck of trouble, and never a laugh but the moans come double. And that is life, Negro life." Being a Negro in America means being scarred by a history of slavery and family disorganization. Negroes have grown accustomed now to hearing unfeeling and insensitive whites say other immigrant groups, such as the Irish, the Jews, and the Italians, started out with similar handicaps, and yet they made it. Why haven't the Negroes done the same? These questioners refuse to see that the situation of other immigrant groups 100 years ago and the situation of the Negro today cannot be usefully compared. Negroes were brought here in chains long before the Irish voluntarily to leave Ireland, or the Italians thought of leaving Italy. Some Jews may have left their homes in Europe involuntarily, but they were not in chains when they arrived on these shores. Other immigrant groups came to America with language and economic handicaps, but not with the stigma of color. Above all, no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil, and no other group has had its family structure deliberately torn apart. This is the rub. Today, there is considerable discussion about the disintegration of the Negro family in the urban ghettos. We need only to learn something about the special origins of the Negro family to discover the root of the problem. The Negro family for 300 years has been on the tracks of racing locomotives of American history, dragged along, mangled, and crippled. Pettigrew has pointed out that the American slavery is distinguished from all other forms of slavery because it consciously dehumanizes the Negro. In Greece and Rome, for example, slaves preserved dignity and a measure of family life. Our institution of slavery, on the other hand, began with the breakup of families on the coast of Africa. Because the Middle Passage was long and expensive, African families were torn apart in the interest of selectivity, as if the members were beasts. In the ship's holds, Black captives were packed spoon fashion to live on a voyage often lasting 2 to 6 months in a space for each the size of a coffin. If water ran short, or famine threatened, or a plague broke out, whole cargoes of living and dead were thrown overboard. The sheer physical torture was sufficient to murder millions of men, women, and children, but even more incalculable was the psychological damage. Of those families who survived the voyage, many more were ripped apart on the auction block as soon as they reached American shores. Against this ghastly background, the Negro family began life in the United States. On the plantation, the institution of legal marriage for slaves did not exist. The masters might direct mating, or if they did not, marriage occurred without sanctions. There were polygamous relationships, fragile monogamous relationships, illegitimacies, abandonment, and the repetitive tearing apart of families as children, husbands, and wives were sold to other plantations. But these cruel conditions were not yet the whole stories. Masters and their sons used Negro women to satisfy their spontaneous lust, or, when more humane attitudes prevailed, as concubines. The depths were reached in Virginia, which we sentimentally call the state of presidents. There were slaves that were bred for sale there, not casually or incidentally, but in a vast, deliberate program which produced enormous wealth for slave owners. This breeding program was one answer to the legal halting of the slave traffic early in the 19th century. Against these odds, the Negro family struggled to survive through the antebellum era, and miraculously, many did. In all this psychological and physical horror, many slaves managed to hold on to their children and develop warmth and affection and family loyalties against the smashing tides of emotional corruption and destruction. It's part of the excerpt, and I invite you to read it. It is gripping and telling, and I am going to hasten on to where are we going. I'm trying to edit as I'm going. As the administration had manifested a faltering and fluctuating interest in civil rights during the past year, a flood of words rather than deeds has inundated the dry desert of expectations. One curious explanation of the defaults of the government warrants analysis because it reveals, without intention, the disadvantages under which the civil rights movement has labored. After describing the obvious, the president's overwhelming preoccupation with the war in Vietnam, it then argues that in 1965, the president was prepared to implement measures leading to full equality, but waited in vain for the civil rights movement to offer the programs. The movement is depicted as absorbed in controversy, confused in direction, venal toward its friends, and in such turmoil, it has tragically lost its golden opportunity to attain change today. This argument, by explaining everything in terms of the presence or absence of programs, illuminates how the insistence on programs can be used as a sophisticated device to evade action. Actually, there was no dearth of programs in 1965, ranging from my own proposal published in 1964 for a Bill of Rights for the Disadvantaged to elaborate and detailed programs in the published materials of many agencies, organizations, and individual social scientists. If there had been a sincere disposition seriously to entertain a program, its preparation, its final form would have taken but a few weeks. If the federal government had been consumed with fervor to strike an effective blow for civil rights, it need only have begun implementing all the existing laws that are a nullity from one end of the country to another. And I pause there because, again, this is prophetic work, but we see where diversity, equity, and inclusion has been assaulted and suffered. And even one president who thought turn back those diversity and inclusion where there might be certain types of race theory that might be infused in programs. Give us programs. No, give us power. Instead of expecting for us to bring programs, take action. And so in this season of diversity, equity, and inclusion, where organizations and governments alike, on the wake of violence happening, especially around George Floyd's murder, now we see where organizations are abandoning some of those programs, abandoning them, asking for those that have been oppressed to come up with solutions, instead of those that have been part of the oppression to be responsible for solutions. Such a prophetic work. As I hasten on, because we're close to our close, I will go to Little Fires Everywhere, Pandemic, Protests, Politics, and Powers, co-authored by Dr. Valencia Etner, who is a member of our community, and Dr. Van Carl Williams. I'm reading from their epilogue, and then I will close with the Audacity of Hope epilogue. And their epilogue says, Why the Fires Will Continue, subtitled, Waiting No More, the Time Is Now. 401 years ago, African Americans arrived on these shores, and the diabolical institution of slavery, which morphed from a labor experiment to a serial, intentionally dehumanizing, disregarding, stereotyping, murdering, hate-ridden, generationally reinforced mindset that has so infiltrated the very fiber of America that it has taken an enough is enough diverse grassroots movement to even get those who are the beneficiaries of the ingrained mindset and its economic benefits to even consider what has been perpetrated for 400 plus years. For those who thought that electing an African American president was the recompense, Moscow Mitch, for the systemic ways in which those whose foreparents were slaves in this country are treated to this day, you are categorically mistaken. The election of Barack Hussein Obama was a collective choice, but did not obliterate the system of racism. And while he was able to achieve this pinnacle, his status did not and does not excuse or allow for a misconstrued judgment on those in the African American community who have not been given the same opportunities or who have been blocked, misguided, and dismissed by bigoted educators, racial officials, and employers, and yes, those in the religious community who have consistently misinterpreted biblical text for political gain. This protest and subsequent response to the death of George Floyd and others is not an all-of-a-sudden phenomenon. It has been bubbling for decades like a fire ready to combust. The cries of mistreatment have been ignored and disregarded. The pain of unmerited death by those sworn to protect and serve all people continues even in the midst of protests. The wealth disparity, which results in a lack of basic needs, including living in food deserts and a lack of quality health care, have contributed to the disproportionate occurrence of the deadly COVID-19 virus and its effect on African Americans. These tangible issues, along with the ever-present undercurrent of assumptions of diminished intelligence, age-old stereotypical expectations of character and integrity deprivation, and the ever-present adages of not good enough, not smart enough, not attractive enough, have fueled to the no more resolve of African Americans. The struggle of waking up Black in America has activated the masses, especially the young who are not willing to fall victim to the weight posture of older generations. For Black Lives Matter, Colors of Change, and other groups that are crossing racial demographics, the time is now. No more waiting, no more talking and doing little. And while the tenets of faith have a place, these groups are not waiting for a preacher to lead them. They are not interested in diffusing the anger with hallelujahs or initiating the olive branch. They are demanding intuition by the perpetrator. And until penitence and reparations are evident, and until there is substantive change, there will be no calm, no justice, no peace. Here's the truth. The time had to come. There was no avoiding it, especially in an overt racist Trumpian environment. The infection has never been healed, only bandaged while still hurting. The scab of civil rights has never been fused into the skin of America, and the sore stays raised. Only when the perfunctory, rudimentary, going through the motions acts give way to real acknowledgement and repentance with action will America ever hope to be the United States. In fact, it needs to cease from using that erroneous description until it resembles the truth. America, God's grace, which is sung about, America the Beautiful, has been cheapened by the inability or lack of desire to see and acknowledge the sins of white foreparents as slave owners and rapists and capitalist pimps, by the cheering of the masses as multiple persons were lynched merely because of their heritage, by the twisting of scripture to uphold the dehumanizing of persons throughout its history, by the institutionally driven profiling of African American men as probably criminal, no matter their status, by the over-sexualization of African American women, by zoning and city planning that allows food deserts to make quality food inaccessible for many communities, by substandard health care, if available at all, and by the reduced expectation of educational systems that position African American children to underachieve, continuing the vicious cycle of poverty and disenfranchisement. For those who ask, what do they want? Let's start with the above mentioned issues. Then maybe we can sit at the table and figure out if united is attainable. But until then, we will protest, plan, push policy, and yes, pray simultaneously. We are skilled, capable, astute, and angry enough that backing down is not an option. Waiting is a hard no. Their time is now. Pay attention. That is the epilogue. And as we prepare to close at 7:05, I wanted to read from the epilogue of The Audacity of Hope by President Barack Hussein Obama. I think is a close, a beautiful fitting to our excerpts on the dream. What satisfies me now, I think, being useful to my family and the people who elected me, he writes, leaving behind a legacy that will make our children's lives more hopeful than our own. Sometimes working in Washington, I feel I am meeting that goal. At other times, it seems like the goal recedes from me, and all the activity I engage in, the hearings and speeches and press conferences and position papers, are an exercise in vanity, useful to no one. When I find myself in such moods, I like to take a run along the mall. Usually I go in the early evening, especially in the summer and fall, when the air in Washington is warm and still, and the leaves on the trees barely rustle. After dark, not many people are out. Perhaps a few couples taking a walk, or homeless men on benches organizing their possessions. Most of the time, I stop at the Washington Monument, but sometimes I push on across the street to the National World War II Memorial, then along the reflecting pool to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, then up to the stairs of the Lincoln Memorial. At night, the great shrine is lit but often empty. Standing between marble columns, I read the Gettysburg's address and the second inaugural address. I look out over the reflecting pool, imagining the crowd stilled by Dr. King's mighty cadence. And then beyond that, to the floodlit obelisk and shining Capitol dome. And in that place, I think about America and those who built it. This nation's founders who somehow rose above petty ambitions and narrow calculations to imagine a nation unfurling across a continent. And those like Abraham Lincoln and Dr. Martin Luther King, who ultimately laid down their lives in the service of perfecting an imperfect union. And all the faceless, nameless men and women, slaves and soldiers, and tailors and butchers, constructing lives for themselves and their children and grandchildren, brick by brick, rail by rail, calloused hand by calloused hand, to fill in the landscape of our collective dreams. It is that process I wish to be a part of. My heart is filled with love for this country. And I echo that sentiment in that this country I speak of is the one that Dr. King envisioned, a beloved community where we would be recognized by the content of our character and not the color of our skin. I believe because of his efforts and the giving of his life to perfect what was an imperfect union from the beginning, I now am able to enjoy many things that might not have been a reality for me. Happy birthday, Dr. Martin Luther King. We still hear the drum beat, and we will get in line and in fashion and in step to continue to pursue and make the dream a reality. I'm Marcus Holmes. I'm the love activist of the facilitator of the Love and Stuff community. And I believe, like Dr. King believed, that love is what we need to be all about. Love is what will drive hate out. And I hope that in celebrating, that you will consider that you are a part of the dream of people who saw an imperfect union and sought to perfect it. If you and I only live out our dreams, and our dreams are about our four and no more, and we don't have a vision of the beloved community, and maybe you wouldn't call it that, but we don't have a dream about a community filled with love, where people aren't killing each other, and where people aren't robbing each other, and where people have a fair chance for quality education and decent housing, and a fair chance to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then our dreams are selfish. Our dreams should be broad enough that they impact the goodwill and good life of others. And that's why I'm thankful for the large footprints of Dr. King, who showed us the way to that. Now, there are those who will say that nonviolence wasn't the way to that. And it could be the good Christian heart of those of us who believe that there is a nonviolent way. But I want you to know that when you're thinking about the violent way does not secure the future of all. It puts at peril the future of some. And it says that there is no grace or no opportunity for people to change their ways, change their thinking, change their patterns of behavior. And I would suggest to you that that would be wrong. That we should, by the grace of God, give even those who we have seen do evil works to be able to be overcome with good. And that's what the call of the Love and Stuff community is across all platforms, to stand in a place where we declare love where there has been evil or injustice or loneliness or suicide or depression or recession, that we stand in the gap and declare that love is the prescription for the day. I hope that you will take this holiday and that you will go forward through this year thinking of ways that you can bring equality, if but in your neighborhood, so that others will understand the kingly dream of a man and join the step, the pace, and the rhythm to bring the dream to fruition. I hope that you will have a great evening, and we'll close with a few of his quotes as we did at the opening. And I'm just so pleased and honored that you were able to join us and be here tonight. Enjoy the rest of the holiday.
The nonviolent movement for social change must be properly interpreted, as well as developing programs that will deal with the issues of today.
Dear Coretta.
Dear Coretta.
Dear phenomenal woman.
Dear mother, I can still hear your voice lifted in song. I can still see the warmth in your eyes and feel the gentle wisdom of your words.
You had a vision of the future that felt impossible to so many. But your faith, fortitude, and integrity laid the groundwork for it to become a reality.
Thank you, Mrs. Coretta.
For creating, for singing, for leading, for being.
Heal the wounded soul. There is a God.
You didn't just teach it, you lived it. You told your own story in your own words. When others spoke over you, you let your actions be a guide for those who chose to see.
You are glorious, not because you are perfect, but because life's imperfections taught you grace. Sharpen your compassion and your passions.
At this point, I feel even stronger, and I want you to know that you have my utmost support.
You stared down hate, stood firm in your beliefs,
protected the small, prepared a place for those who were oppressed. You showed us that resistance is a discipline, integrity is a practice in empathy, and courage can be cultivated by each and every one of us.
When people decide to be free and they are united together in that effort, nothing can stop them.
You weathered storms, rebuilt from charred embers, conquered fear, and laughed a lot.
You told us that we could be anything and that our circumstances didn't define our greatness. Most of all, you taught us that our dreams matter. Dear Coretta.
Dear Coretta.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.